Good evening. This is your host, Dan Zupansky, for the program True Murder, the most shocking killers in true crime history, and the authors that have written about them. This week, as announced, to be announced was the title of the program. I'm going to use the opportunity tonight to talk about my book, Trophy Kill, but more importantly, just an update of what's been happening with the trial. The crime occurred in 2003, and in July 1st, 2003, and here we are almost 7 years from that date, and we're still in the appeal process. The appeal occurred, and I attended on May 21st, and here we are at June 23rd, and still the judges have reserved their decision on this incredible case. The most, I think, for anybody that reads about this from my book, Trophy Kill, The Shall We Dance Murder, will be aware of incredibly curious decision to take so long for such a obvious murder case with really no an appeal on 13 grounds. Well, we'll talk about the appeal and on what points they appealed the sentence. For those that have not heard about Trophy Kill, I will tell you about the book that I became involved with in 2004. First off, let me tell you a little bit of background about the case itself. In 2003, on July 1st, in Winnipeg, Canada, the Miramax movie Shall We Dance was being filmed, starring Jennifer Lopez, Richard Gere, and Susan Sarandon. Jennifer Lopez wasn't in the city as of yet, but she was set to arrive in a few days after July 1st. And the paparazzi, who always follow really popular celebrities around, were in town ready for the arrival of Jennifer Lopez. And then at that time, Jennifer Lopez was engaged to actor Ben Affleck, and there was a little bit of controversy where Ben Affleck was filming in Vancouver, and there was some talk of some rendezvous with a dancer in Vancouver. And as people know, in Jennifer Lopez's life, that marriage didn't work out. So it was a real seminal time for their relationship and Jennifer Lopez's career, I guess, and more importantly, personal relationship. Anyway, they were shooting the film Shall We Dance in Winnipeg, and Susan Sarandon had been in town for a couple of weeks, and so had Richard Gere. And Richard Gere had been taking dancing lessons at a studio downtown next to a bar called the Woodbine Hotel. And that will be important a little bit later on. Anyway, on July 1st, she called police. Susan Sarandon called police after her and her assistant noticed that some jewelry had been taken from her trailer after they had been recently at the trailer taking off the jewelry. It was worn. It's a necklace with a amulet, a bar. Anyway, if you go to the movie, there are certain scenes where she is wearing this older-looking pendant with a chain and a bar attached, and the amulet or pendant attached to that necklace, gold necklace. Anyway, she reported this gold necklace, a silver bracelet, and a couple earrings stolen from her trailer from the set of the Miramax movie Shall We Dance. And this was on July 1st. On July 2nd, again, police were still looking for this jewelry. They had no clues as to where this jewelry had gotten to. And on July 2nd, around 9 a.m., about 24 hours later or so, after this jewelry had been reported stolen, maybe less, a man named Sidney Teerhuis, and that's spelled T-E-E-R-H-U-I-S, Sidney, walked into a police station, and they reported at that time very calmly, especially under the circumstances, calmly walked into what he thought was a police station, but it was actually a remand center, and the remand center was for those people awaiting bail on remand. So they were in custody. So it wasn't, in fact, a police station, but I guess the next best thing if you're going to report a crime. Anyway, walked in there and said he wanted to talk to somebody, and they asked him what it was about. He said he wanted to basically speak to somebody in private, and a man named Donald Stevenson took him in the back and asked him, well, how can I help you here? What's the problem? And he said, listen, I want to turn myself in because I think I killed somebody. And he said, hey, just hang on. I'm not the person you should say this to. He had a phone, and he gave Sidney the number and said, hey, listen, dial this number, call these people. This is we're not the police. Call the police and tell them. And then tell them where you are. So he called the police, and a woman named Susan Sarandon answered the phone and asked him if she could help him, and he basically repeated that he wanted to turn himself in because he had met this man the day before, and they had drank alcohol all day, and he claimed to have passed out intoxicated, and when he awoke some many hours later, he went to the bathroom and discovered his acquaintance dead in the bathtub, chopped up in the bathtub. So that's what he told the 911 operator when he spoke to her. And she said, well, how did you kill him? How'd you do it? He said, well, I used a knife. And where's the knife now? Well, it's left under the bathtub. So he told her where the weapon was. And so there was a few details, but basically that's what he had said to them. And she testified much later on and noted to the police that he was very calm, very nonchalant, very unemotional. I guess from years of experience with people under certain similar circumstances of finding someone dead, they would have reacted differently. So that was noted. Anyway, the police they arrived at the remand center. It's a short distance away from the police station, public safety building, and they arrived there some 15 or 20 minutes later, and then were pointed out to Sidney sitting on a bench near the door, and they asked him to repeat his story, and he said he gave more detail. He said he had met the man. They met at the Woodbine, and they met for drinks, and he said he first met Robin Green, the victim, when he came into the Woodbine trying to sell a gold necklace, and he was not interested, he said, but he was interested in Robin Green, and they drank together for a short period of time, and then Sidney had said to Robin, hey, listen, I've got some drinks at my hotel, and it's just down the laneway at the Royal Albert Arms Hotel. So they both agreed to go back to the hotel. Now, Sidney claims that they had sex, and there were photos taken with a disposable camera of Robin Green posing in various different clothing and different poses throughout the apartment. And Sidney claimed that they had homosexual sex. They had sex in the apartment, in the rented hotel room. And then they decided to go outside, get some cold beer. It was an especially hot day, July 1st. And they went from the hotel and then went back in the general area. In fact, more so, right in back to almost where the trailers were, and more importantly, where there was barricades set up and security, because they were shooting some outdoor scenes for the Shall We Dance movie, and fans and of the movie stars and just general onlookers were near the area, and hence the reason for the barricades and the security. And it was quite a scene, basically, with a few hundred people milling around, trying to get a sense of what was going on and see if they could get a peek at one of their movie stars. And anyway, Sidney and Robin went into a park that's known for homosexuals to frequent, and they sat there and they had some more drinks, and they stayed there for a couple hours, we'll say. I'm not sure how long, and then they came back to the hotel. So they came back to the hotel, and Sidney wanted to get some ice, and he spoke to the bartender, who was named Diane Last, and he asked Diane Last to watch his friend while he went downstairs and got ice for the two of them. And basically she noted to the police that he was staggering and was really unsteady on his feet, and Sidney returned from the basement with his ice, and the two of them then bid Diane Last, the bartender, goodbye, and they went upstairs to the hotel room. Now, I'm sorry if I get the story a little convoluted, but this is the order of events that happened. The last anyone saw of Robin Green was what I just spoke about. Diane Last was the last witness to see Robin Green alive. The next day, Sidney Teerhuis walked into that remand center and then told police that he had woken from a blackout with this gentleman to find him dead in the bathtub. Now, when the police arrived at the remand center, the three of them then went to the hotel room. They went up the elevator to room 309, and they walked in, and despite the police officers being prepared for, he said the body would be chopped up, dismembered body, they were not, and no one, I think, could ever be prepared for what they would find. Now, it was a small room, and as soon as they walked in, the female officer, Sylvia Schroeder, proceeded to look at the cot or the mattress that was in the room. And it's a very small room. Dirty, old, musky, hot, filthy room. At that time, strewn with blood-soaked underwear. They could see that immediately. There was dozens of pairs of underwear with blood. They also she was in the room quickly. Like I say, it's a very small room, and she could see that there was numerous stab wounds to the mattress and blood all over the mattress and blood over the wall and blood leading up to the washroom, which was right there off this small room. And there was a door, and the bathroom, if you were to go in, when the police officer, he didn't go in with the Sylvia Schroeder, she stayed back. He is the only officer that went into the, and his name is August Marin. He went through the doorway and immediately was hit with the display. The body was posed and displayed facing the doorway as the officer would go in. The body had been cut into 8 separate pieces, but reassembled. The head was decapitated. Well, that head was back on the neck and the shoulders. The arms were cut off at the elbows and the legs cut off at the knees. And those were placed, again, in a display back where they would normally be. The victim was castrated cleanly, so the penis and the testicles were there sitting where they would have been, but detached from the body. One of the eyes was gouged out and the other was deflated, and one of the nipples was missing, and part of the arm was dissected. But more importantly, what you couldn't miss was the slice from the neck right down to the waist, and everything that would normally have been in the body cavity was gone. The liver, the heart, the lungs, the windpipe, the intestines, the everything, the heart was gone. And it wasn't in the apartment, the rented room. And it ends up, it's nowhere to be found. They searched probably a mile radius of the hotel and the sewer system. Nothing. The body was in the bathtub. The body was clean. There was no blood anywhere. So this sight that this police officer saw just froze him, transfixed him. You can imagine he just froze as he took this in slowly. It took him almost, apparently about 3 minutes to take all this information in, process it, to go from this initial shock to eventual recognition of what you're seeing, and then just revulsion. And he staggered out of the room, made it to the doorway, held himself up in the doorway, and it's incredible, a blow, a psychological blow to your mind. Even Jack the Ripper had not done. As he escalated in his murders, Jack the Ripper didn't do what Sidney Teerhuis did. There have been killers have displayed their victims. But in writing this book, I had to do the research. He's totally unique. Now, of course, he was charged for murder. But this being Canada, he was automatically charged for second-degree murder. And at trial, the possibility of reducing that second-degree murder charge to manslaughter is a good possibility, given precedent. And given at that time that pretrial custody counted for twice, and sentences were typically from 6 to 10 years, in all practical terms, I'll get right down to the practical math here, that a person that would be convicted in other jurisdictions of murder is and was and very well could be walking the streets in 3 or 4 years, typically. Despite the ability of giving someone a life sentence for manslaughter, because of lesser lenient precedents being set, the judges and the courts themselves, either through appeal or in actual sentencing, chose this seemingly lenient sentence, especially. It's not a matter of punishment, it's a matter of appropriate sentencing and appropriate identification of someone as a murderer. Manslaughter sounds like you went out hunting and you were drunk and or some accidental death that of course you were responsible, but less responsible. Now, I don't want to get caught up in that, but I wanted to make sure that the audience understands that. This is a completely different system than the United States of America. Regardless of a clear premeditation and evidence of premeditation in this particular case, that this killer set out to find a victim, kill him, display and pose his body in this murder horror spectacle, as I call it, for lack of a better term, merely once he knew he had Susan Sarandon's stolen jewelry, he decided to end, I contend, his reign of terror, his reign of horror, and hence he walked to authorities and said, listen, I think I killed somebody. I woke up and, don't remember anything, of course, but I think I killed this person. Now, if you apply the same logic that would direct you or I or someone else this is not what can apply with the serial killer. In my book, we go somewhat into serial killing so people understand what the serial killer profile really is. And I know a lot of people have read a lot of true crime. It's some of the same information. I've tried to provide just the relevant information for people to understand more so. The psychopathic mind is a given, a person with no conscience. We're past that level. But the truly unique aspects of some serial killers are that they have a strange I guess strange to everyone else, idea of mixing sex and murder. And these start off as fantasies early in their lives, typically, but in the end, sex and murder are synonymous. They're desired. That is the fantasy. Murder creates a sexual feeling, a sexual desire, and a sexual release. And part of the sexual fantasy is murder. There are lots of classifications. There are the sadistic killers, but this person, I would say, classifies as a lust killer by definition. I interviewed a gentleman named Robert K. Ressler, and anybody who's read true crime knows who Robert K. Ressler is. Basically was one of the people that established the behavioral science unit, or the behavioral unit at the Quantico in Virginia, Quantico Beach, or Quantico, pardon me, Quantico field office in the FBI field office that talked about, that created the serial killer profile in the first place. So I interviewed Robert K. Ressler many years ago. Before I had ever done this, it seemed strange and more than a coincidence that I would have spoken to him about John Wayne Gacy and Jeffrey Dahmer. This killer has spoken, even initially in the first interviews, shortly after the murder, spoke about comparisons to Jeffrey Dahmer. And later on, there is much talk about Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, Ted Bundy, Aileen Wuornos, serial killers, notorious serial killers, famous serial killers. It's very important. Now, after this crime, there was international coverage of this crime, of this murder, because of one reason primarily. The paparazzi were in Winnipeg and, as such, reported on the crime, and celebrity online sites and mainstream newspapers, New York Times, all kinds of media reported on the crime for a short few days, because at first it was thought that Jennifer Lopez's jewelry, or at least it was reported by the paparazzi that Jennifer Lopez's jewelry had been stolen. Of course, Jennifer Lopez is much more important to the world in terms of celebrity than Susan Sarandon. And shortly after, it was reported that Susan Sarandon's jewelry was found a few feet away from this horror spectacle. And the paparazzi reported sensationalistically that it was found in a pool of blood, which is inaccurate. But needless to say, that jewelry was found a few feet away from this murder scene, this crime scene. A few weeks after this crime, the police service determined, and take this as you will, they determined that the jewelry had no significance in terms of the motive for the murder. Now, I'm not sure how they determined that, but if they were to say we have no evidence that the jewelry has anything to do with the motive in this murder, well, then I guess that's easier to prove, that there is no clear or conclusive evidence that the jewelry had anything to do in terms of the motive. But the only person that knows if the jewelry had anything to do with, in terms of the motive for this murder, is the killer himself. Now, I believe if the killer himself were to admit that, rather than what he did claim, which was, I woke up and I don't remember, and so I should be guilty of manslaughter because I was intoxicated and hence didn't have the necessary intent to kill. That's how the law is interpreted here. But in this case, in this very extreme case, this very emotional, sensationalistic case, it seems absurd that this person who was butchered, posed, and displayed, certainly you may not be able to conclusively say that the jewelry that was sitting there became the motive for this killer, this incredible killer, this unique, vicious, psychopathic killer to come forward to tell police, listen, I killed somebody, go check it out. Then he grants interviews right away. He says, I'm not Jeffrey Dahmer. Smiling face, front page of the newspaper, claiming he has no memory. This is a person that clearly craves celebrity. Again, another feature of, we really don't study one-off killers, people that have only killed one person. They often study sadistic killers, killers that torture, killers that capture or abduct, killers like this that clearly have something over and beyond the run-of-the-mill killer, the, we'll say, more understandable killer. This is much more than a random killing. This is much more than anger. It's much more. So, this killer had the attention of the world because of Susan Sarandon's stolen jewelry. The police quickly say that the jewelry had nothing to do with the motive. And hence, that jewelry doesn't have to be a crime exhibit. No one, including Susan Sarandon nor her assistant, has to come and testify as to actual events. The Shall We Dance movie, any footage that had been shot with Susan Sarandon wearing that jewelry, and there is a fair amount of footage where she is wearing that jewelry in the film, a matter of budget, a matter of scheduling, and a matter of course talking about continuity. That jewelry could not be tied up in court or as a police exhibit or any other such thing, and no one else could afford nor would want to come and testify as to any kind of events, nor would Shall We Dance, Miramax, want to have anything to do with the negative publicity of that murder. And that's all I'll say about it. That's all. If I say more than that, then it sounds like I'm speculating on why things were done. But it's very interesting to see how almost all media took out that very important reference out of the story. Now, maybe it's not a conspiracy. Maybe, who knows? I mean, I see things that make no sense whatsoever, why a story or certain portions of the story are not followed up on. The Winnipeg Sun, as opposed to the Winnipeg Free Press, the crime reporter for the Free Press was out of town at the time the crime occurred. And the Winnipeg Sun, a reporter named Kerry Castanga, now with the Edmonton Sun, had exclusive interviews with Sidney, where he spoke freely and clearly demonstrated to me at that time, where I was not involved with the case whatsoever, that this clearly was an unusual killer of the ilk that I had read about, and I had been fascinated by some of these psychopathic minds, these killers. The Jeffrey Dahmers, I think I'm not alone in finding their cases fascinating. This aberration. I mean, I read Silence of the Lambs. I thought it was a fascinating fictional book. Shortly after is the true story of Jeffrey Dahmer. You have to be moved to read the non-fiction account of Jeffrey Dahmer after you seemingly enjoyed Silence of the Lambs. That's all I can say. I think it would find it unusual that you would not read the story of Jeffrey Dahmer, at least in the magazines. I didn't go out and buy every book conceivable, but it was hard not to be, again, at least interested in this story that happened just on the heels of a movie that shocked people and won great praise for being a realistic movie. And so, anyway, getting back to Sidney Teerhuis, it was clear that this was a case that had caught my attention, and I was a radio host producing a show on the University of Manitoba radio. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate what that is. It's I saw it as an apprentice journalist. That was my apprenticeship, being able to have a 1-hour live program, and with that, all of the things that can go wrong, and being able to have the ability, despite not having a huge audience or even a provable audience, that I would have the kind of guests that I wanted to have on the program, important guests speaking about important issues that often or typically didn't get airtime on conventional mainstream media, or they weren't explored in the in-depth way that I could afford to with a 1-hour interview-style format with no phone calls. So we kept it very informational. Obviously, not everybody is interested in a 1-hour format, but like this program and much of talk radio proves, there is an intelligent, discerning, and attentive audience that if you give them information and you keep their attention, they will certainly tune in and listen and get the information that you're trying to impart to them. So anyway, at that time, I was at the University of Manitoba. I just happened to be the chairman of media and policy affairs for a group called People for Justice. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a right-winger guy at all. I am so far away from that description of that type of personality. I have been moved in the 16 years that I have lived in this city to be much more concerned about the most serious of crime and how the judicial system deals with the most serious of crime. I have said before that I applaud Canada for understanding the difference between people that actually can be rehabilitated or people that are should be given a chance at a young age to turn their lives around. I'm not, I don't think, in Canada we depict the United States as harsh, lock 'em up kind of society with imprisonment rates quite high in terms of the rest of the world. We fear these mandatory minimums for 3 strikes and you're out. But regardless, we are very ignorant of the U.S. system and how it deals with serious criminals. And also I've read and heard many accounts of how the United States as a whole basically experimented with more lenient sentences and probably dealt with the same kinds of issues that we have, whereas we think that we can give a person another chance based on their behavior in prison, all kinds of concepts like this. But now you see much harsher sentencing in most states in the United States, and the ability to have mandatory sentences life sentences where there is no chance of parole, or at least consecutive sentencing where the multiple crimes of these killers is added so that there is no practical possibility of parole. In Canada, we do not have that type of device, and we do have a mindset that has grown to believe that we can rehabilitate anyone. I really do believe that is part of the actual mindset that we had a famous killer here, a politician who assassinated his wife and was convicted with very convincing evidence in this country, despite him having the ability to hire the best of lawyers and mount the best of defenses. And this person was convicted of murder. Now, despite not admitting that he murdered his wife, they still let this guy out after 23 years. Just let him out. So it's a different system. Now, back to Sidney Teerhuis. I had been doing the radio show. I was involved with People for Justice as chairman of Media and Policy Affairs. We were dealing with things like no consecutive sentences, conditional sentences for crimes that would have had severe punishment previously. They made conditional sentences for people that were apparently first-time offenders or non-serious offenders. In a few short years, those conditional sentences were applied even to things like manslaughter, serious assault, child pornography, all kinds of charges like that. I apologize. I won't go too far into Canada's system that I'm very critical of. Now, when I was at the radio station, I was doing a weekly interview program, and I knew a gentleman from the home city where I was, and he was incarcerated on some charges and asked me if he could call me from the remand center and help them take care of a little bit of business. Now, I'm not in the habit of helping out criminals while they're in prison, but I knew this gentleman. They weren't serious charges, and I was convinced that he would be cleared on the charges. Anyway, long story short, I let him simply call me from jail, and I helped him do a little bit of banking business, and as I'd known him for years and years. Anyway, a few months later, this was in the fall, in January he called me to say, geez, guess who is in the same jail range as I am? And it ended up being Sidney Teerhuis, the killer. Now, I saw it as a fateful turn of events. I asked my acquaintance, my friend, if he would ask Sidney Teerhuis if he would be interested in being interviewed on radio. He said he agreed. My friend said, yeah, he agreed. He would do it at some point. And then I thought about it for a few days and said, you know what, I think this is my opportunity to actually be a real journalist and write about this case, because it's a fascinating case. He is likely, well, it's not likely, he will have the opportunity to have his murder charge reduced to manslaughter and walk out of jail in a few short years. And in my mind, despite what I know about this crime, despite what I think this person may be, and I really didn't know much at that time, except the description of the crime. I read the interviews, I saw his smiling face. I think inherently, before I had done all of the research I had to do this book, that I realized inherently, intuitively, that he was psychopathic, that he had the qualities of a serial killer and qualities of the most eccentric, the most infamous, the most notorious serial killers, the people that try to outdo everyone else, the people that may have been influenced by the ghastly deeds of everyone from Jack the Ripper through Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, people emulating their role models, their heroes. All I could see intuitively that this guy was special, different, unique, and the story was worth writing about. Especially when I thought, geez, this is my friend. He's there. All I did was make a decision to think, geez, I know this guy can remember what he did. That's hilarious that anybody would believe otherwise. And that's all I knew. And I went into this not knowing much else, kind of stumbling in it. Again, a fateful turn of events. I really can't go back into how my life changed in a short few months. But what we do have is this book that was released on April the 19th of this year, 2010, Trophy Kill, The Shall We Dance Murder, The Trial and Revelations of a Psychopathic Killer. Now, in the year that I corresponded with Sidney Teerhuis, he was under no illusions what was going to happen. We had a straightforward agreement. We were going to write a book about him and this trial. And that's not really any different than any true crime book where you would talk about the killer, talk about the victim, talk about the trial, talk about the story, basically. And all of the inside information or behind-the-scenes information, whether it come from a Crown attorney district attorney, you would call in the United States. We call it crown attorney here. Same thing, prosecuting attorneys. The same inside information that makes for a good true crime book eventually made for this book to be different and unique. In the year that Sidney Teerhuis corresponded with me, he began with everything from his earliest life from memory, where he was adopted as a young child. His mother was 15 years old, gave the child away. She was on a small reserve called Little Grand Rapids, a couple 100 miles away from Winnipeg, which is about 700,000 people, a big city, 8th biggest city in Canada. And he was adopted by a white family, even though he was an Aboriginal child, and named Teerhuis. So his original name was Sidney Owens, and he became Sidney Teerhuis. And they officially adopted him. At first, they did, I guess, they were foster parents, and then they officially adopted him when he was 3 years old. On July 2nd was the actual date he became Sidney Teerhuis. And I think that's important because when you look at July 2nd is when he went in to police in Winnipeg and reported his crime. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. In that year correspondence, he started with his whole life. And of course, he spoke of, I'm not saying of course, but I wasn't so surprised that there was claims of sexual abuse by his stepbrother and claims of sexual abuse by all kinds of people. And he spoke of the underage male prostitution scene in Winnipeg. Whether it's true or not, I could never really investigate his claims. It's fascinating, the stories that he does tell. He is a good writer. He would have had possibly a future as a writer, I don't know, but he's a decent writer. He has an eloquent style. He's very descriptive. It makes for fascinating reading. In that year period, we didn't become pen pals. This was a working project, so I peppered him with questions constantly on the telephone, and when I wrote letters, which were not that many, I included as many questions as possible and didn't beat around the bush. I just kept hammering home questions, like very important questions right from the very beginning. What happened to the internal organs? What'd you do with them? Where'd they go? Eventually, I don't want to make it sound like I wasn't a crafty person or a clever person in my questioning of this person, but I will tell you honestly that it is more so that this person really wanted to tell somebody everything. And at some point, after about 9 or 10 months of corresponding with me, he wanted to tell me about the murder itself. I didn't have to pry this information out. It came in a flood in around 10 months after we start corresponding, which was around January. I visited him once in the Remand Center, and that's in the book as well. Now, a lot of these letters came in that 10 months to 12-month period, and a series of letters, maybe over a dozen, and diagrams depicting, describing every single graphic and gory detail of the murder, dismemberment, the enjoyment of the dismemberment, the preparation of the dismemberment, the body as a human trophy, as he called it, all the description of the necrophilia, diagrams that corresponded with that. People speak of utter lack of remorse. Not even appropriate. Glee, enjoyment, reveling. Now, not everybody wants to buy a book just to see the most sickening stuff they've ever read. And that's not what I'm promoting here. But I'm promoting to you that this killer has achieved a new level of sinister and evil, combining many of his role model serial killer heroes, unlike Jeffrey Dahmer and Dennis Nielsen from England, and we'll talk about Jeffrey Dahmer and Dennis Nielsen. They kept their bodies, the bodies of their victims. Of course they did horrendous thing. They killed them. Of course they engaged in sex and necrophilia. But unlike Jeffrey Dahmer, that there was some discussion and argument, Robert K. Ressler actually testified at Jeffrey Dahmer's trial to say he was insane at that point. At some point had gone insane, and hence was not responsible like someone else. And we've had the case of a gentleman named Vincent Lee, who cut off a passenger's head on a Greyhound bus and cannibalized him. And he's in a mental institution, not criminally responsible for his crimes. But very much like Hannibal Lecter, this criminal, whereas not as sophisticated as Hannibal Lecter, this person, this killer, has combined the taunting of the victims, the taunting of the police and the entire judicial system, the revenge on his adopted and his biological family. He hyphenated his name at the trial to include his biological name as well. He went to police on the anniversary of his adoption into the Teerhuis family, which he claimed abused him. He used every opportunity to use the media for photo ops. Despite his lawyer's obvious advice not to speak to the media, he spoke anyway. This person contacted the media. I was not the only person he tried to tell his story to. I just happened to be the only person that was willing to hear the story, wanted to hear the ugly truth, the harsh truth. I didn't deceive this person, except that when I had enough evidence that spoke to the motive, the time of the murder, the whereabouts of the missing organs, and then I told him, hey, listen, the law passed that you can't profit from the notoriety of your crime. I said, did you read that? He hung up. And that was the end of the correspondence. And of course, I went to authorities, which I was going to anyway. I mean, you can't give me evidence as a journalist and then expect me to protect that evidence about murder. You know, unlike his lawyer. And that's another story. His lawyer is a person named Greg Brodsky. This is his 49th or 50th year as a defense lawyer. 50th year. He has defended and tried almost 700 murder cases, a record in the English-speaking world. And why I got motivated to get involved with a law reform group in Winnipeg and walk around at the law courts with picket signs and to spend years of my life on this book, despite criticism from a lot of people, and the criticism has not ended. This is an important story for what you find out about how a defense lawyer defends this killer. Everybody says, well, they have to do the best, defend this person to the best of their ability. I agree. What does that mean? What does that entail? The cornerstone of the judicial system is that the lawyer is not to tell a lie on behalf of his client or have his client go on the stand to lie, and a known lie, which you know is a lie. So you don't let your client perjure themselves, and you don't lie on their behalf. Now, people might scoff, well, you're so naive that we just bend that rule. We just tell, and as I've been told by a former district attorney, Crown attorney, we just tell the client right away, don't say anything. Don't tell me anything. Listen to what the Crown has, and then. So he says if the client is halfway smart, I interviewed Greg Brodsky, unbeknownst that I had been corresponding with his client. He told me things that blew my mind. Again, I must be naive. 51 years old, educated, self-educated to what has gone on in the changes in the legal system and the practical sentences that are meted out every day. And I'm not the only person that is criticizing the legal system, the judicial system. But a defense lawyer's responsibility to determine the truth so that he doesn't suborn perjury, he doesn't lie on his client's behalf. You read this book, and there's all kinds of unsubstantiated material that comes out at the trial. His brother sexually abused him. Who says? There was no criminal charges. It's irresponsible, and it's irresponsible as a witness how most witnesses would buckle under some of the techniques that this defense lawyer has learned at the behest of the taxpayer here. Obviously, he has had the lion's share of murder cases in Manitoba and other provinces as well, gaining this invaluable experience, and just if, he crosses over that line in which the judicial cornerstone is built on, that you're not to lie for your client and not to have your client lie. This book is a testament forever to chronicle what occurred on December 1st to 19th, 2008 in Winnipeg, Canada. I call it one of the most important trials, murder trials in Canadian history, for what it clearly demonstrates and what it clearly represents. Very much like the Carla Homolka and Paul Bernardo murder case, in which the reverberations from this chicanery and this black eye, total disgrace, very much like the O.J. Simpson case in America, very much like the Rodney King decision. Travesties of justice. Carla Homolka being released from prison ever is a travesty of justice. For her to be depicted as a battered woman syndrome victim is injustice personified. The psychiatrist that went along with it, the lawyer that went along with it, the lawyer for Paul Bernardo that found the videotapes of the torture and rape of victims, suppressed the videotapes to benefit his own client. A travesty of justice. So it's an ugly story. When you hear the details of the videotapes of the rape, they're ugly. It's sexually ugly. It's murderously ugly. It's information that is ugly. It's the ugliest side of humanity. Inept police, crooked psychiatrists, or inept psychiatry, or psychiatry gone amok, lawyers with totally misplaced loyalty. After all, the taxpayer pays for this. Taxpayer pays for the prosecuting attorneys, pays for the defense attorney, and pays for the entire system. Rehabilitation, incarceration, everything. Now, I don't say that they should have make decisions on what happens. The judge makes that. But would be nice, and it would be important for people to actually understand how the system actually works here. Now, for our American listeners and people to say, why would I buy a book about the Canadian judicial system. It's just a break from some of the true crime books that you have there where it's a foregone conclusion. It's going to be death penalty or life without any chance of parole, or I'll see you, there's no chance of parole. This person had a very, very, very good chance of walking out of prison in 3 or 4 or 5 years. And if you were to read the material that is in this book, and I have chosen not to actually read excerpts from the book because it's too graphic. So I have 2 chapters that, and of course 22 drawings, that there's an explicit, very detailed warning for all people before they read those chapters. You'll read the information in different ways as when they repeat some of that information at trial. But the media, the only person that saw as much as you will see in this book is the jury, who actually had the misfortune of actually having to see the crime scene photos. And when I talk about this book, the most open and shut case, the most obvious case of flagrant murder for the purpose of someone just being famous, a lust killer, I claim he's a serial killer, and I make my contention and my assertion, and I provide the evidence for that. And a lot of that, well, of course, much of that evidence is from the killer himself. The appeal was filed as per his legal right shortly after the conviction, within a month. That was filed in January of 2009. The appeal was heard on May 21st, 2010. I went to the appeal. It was sickening. The defense lawyer used the opportunity to go back into a 2006 jury challenge. Jury of his peers, his client was apparently denied. It was dismissed. The same type of motion was dismissed 8 times, even by the presiding judge's father. It's ridiculous how much time it takes to dismiss something that's totally without merit. That motion in this appeal, which there was 13 grounds of appeal, including that the jury should not have been shown crime scene photos. The jury should not have been shown crime scene photos, that the letter should not have been deemed admissible, that the drawings should not be deemed admissible. Basically, the judges have reserved a decision, and it is now over 30 days for that decision. So it's over 7 years from crime to, again, decision, and who knows, he may just get a new trial. Anyway, the book is Trophy Kill, The Shall We Dance Murder. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, The Trial and Revelations of a Psychopathic Killer. Join me next week for Corey Mitchell with his book, Savage Son. And everyone, have yourself a good evening. And if you've listened this evening, please, trust me, it's the most shocking book you'll ever dare to read, Trophy Kill. Thank you for listening, and have yourselves a good evening. Good night.